Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel, and in this video we'll be covering my round 2 game from the 2022 May Open. My online rating at the time was 1887, and let's take a look at what happened in the game. So in the game I'm playing white, and in fact this is my first game against a Grandmaster. So this is the critical moment. Let's take a look at what happens. So here after rook to c8, I play bishop to b3, sidestepping the attack on my bishop. Here he plays bishop to e8, which is actually a mistake, and here I played the only move that capitalizes on this mistake, which is knight to d5. In this position I actually thought for a really long time. The time control was 40 minutes. Here I spent about 15-ish minutes calculating, as I thought of also this move knight to a4, which, since I noticed that his rooks were on a8 and c8, I potentially have knight to b6 in the future, attacking both rooks, which creates a fork. As well, if he decides to trade to get out of this fork, then potentially I have ideas of rook to c8 in the future, pinning this bishop to the king, as well as pinning this knight to the rook, and maybe I have knight to b6 in the future, kicking away this rook to maybe like the a7 square. Then I can maybe take this knight in the future. However, my ideas here didn't really work after knight to a4 because he simply has to move knight to d7, developing another piece, connecting both of the rooks together, as well as preventing my knight to jumping into this b6 square because his knight controls it now. So instead, I play this move knight to d5. So knight to d5, instead of playing knight to a4, firstly it creates the same threats of attacking both rooks, creating the fork, as well as potential ideas of maybe after he trades then rook to c8 in the future, and also it attacks this bishop, which is really important, and this bishop also comes with a check. So here let's say you play knight to d7 preventing this move, then I simply have knight takes e7. That's the difference from knight to d5 and knight to a4. So in the game, however, let's take a look at the variations. In the game my opponent played rook takes c1, and that's why this bishop being on e7 is really important, since I throw in this move knight takes e7 first. If you're wondering why king to f8 attacks the knight, so I take back the rook. And here, if you're wondering why this is any good for me, it's in fact I actually have this move rook to c7 check, picking up this pawn and also attacking the king, a double attack. So in fact here in the game he plays king to d6. So let's go back and see what other possibilities he could have done here. So here actually in fact rook takes c1 is the best move. In fact if you move the bishop then you simply lose the rook. Let's see, you play pawn takes, and you also lose the rook, same story. So basically you have to react with the rook, as the rook is the undefended piece in this scenario. So of course he plays rook takes c1, knight takes e7, and we skip ahead to here. So here he plays king to d6, attacking my rook. And here I play rook takes pawn. Simply now I'm up a pawn, and I have a better position, since all three of his pieces are still on the back rank, while all three of my pieces are really active. Here he plays knight to c6. I drop my bishop back so I can open up the b3 square for my rook. He plays knight to a5. I play the only move here, which is rook to b4. He plays rook to c8, trying to get on the open file. If I move my bishop in this case, besides from the square d3, I would get back rank checkmated. So for example, let's say I move bishop to e4, then there's simply rook to c1, followed by knight e1 and rook takes c1, and that would be checkmate. So that's his idea. However, here I play knight to e1, dropping my knight back, protecting the bishop. He plays knight to c5, knight to c4. I play bishop d3, attacking. He plays knight back to e5, trying to get in this trade of knight for bishop. I take another pawn. He plays rook a8. I drop my bishop back, and here you can take this pawn, which he does. And here I play the move f3, giving my king a flight square, as well as so that all three of these pieces are not unprotected, and they're all in this really nice clump of pieces together, with my king really safe. He plays knight back to c6, play rook to b3, just glossing over some moves here. And here I found this really nice move. So here after knight to b3, I had realized that I could play rook to c2, for example. However, I thought that this wasn't really favorable for me because there's this move bishop to a4, and this lines up a discovery on my rook potentially. However, the computer still claims I'm better, but in my mind at the time, I didn't think this was really practical for me. So instead I play the move bishop to c4. So I pin this knight to the rook and also attack this knight at the same time. Basically if he takes on d2, then I have bishop takes a2. Here he plays bishop to a4, defending the knight. And I play king to f2, simply getting my king out of the way to prevent ideas of maybe rook to a1 and pinning this knight. Here he plays rook to a1 anyway. I play rook to d3, attacking the knight twice when it's only defended once. Plays knight back to c5, attacking my rook. move my rook back to d2, and he moves his knight back to b3. So here I had a really big decision to make, whether or not I wanted to go back to d3 and get a draw this way, or if I wanted to push for a win. Keep in mind, at this point I'm still up a pawn, so I'm still technically better and I can still push for a win. So here I decided to take the knight to push for the win. He plays rook to b1, and I slowly expand on the king side. Play knight to c5, and here I pick up another pawn. And here it was actually the beginning of the end for him. So rook takes b2, I move my king up, and here I had a pretty important decision to make. I realized that he was probably going to play bishop f1 next move to pick up this g2 pawn. So I was debating on whether or not I should play like a move such as king to h3 to simply defend this. However, I found this to be really passive because he can simply play the move h5. Because after king to h3, if he doesn't do anything, then I can simply take this pawn and I will be even better. However, so here I decided to play the move king to, so I play rook takes h7 first, giving away this pawn as there's no way to prevent bishop f1 and taking the pawn on g2. However, here I decided to get really active with my king, so I play king to g4. My idea is to go king to f5 and take both of these pawns. Bishop takes, I play king to f5, he plays rook to f2. And here I play king takes f6, rook takes pawn, and I play king takes pawn. So now I'm up a clean 2 pawns, and now it's just a simple matter of converting. Here I simply start pushing my pawns. And here I should also keep in mind that here I was actually really low on the clock. I had about 30 seconds. The increment was about 10 seconds. However, I was spending roughly around 10 seconds per move. So basically the increment wasn't doing much except from keeping my time from going down. However, it was still maintaining in the same spot. So here e6, continue pushing the pawns. I sack a pawn because I thought rook to e5 and maybe I can push this pawn through in the future. And here, actually, in fact, I remember I had around 10 seconds left, so I wasn't thinking clearly. So after bishop to h5, in fact, the computer claims there's only one, that this is the final chance for me to actually save the game and make it a win for me. So here I have to play the move knight to d7. So after knight to d7, the threat is, of course, to play knight to f6, forking the king and the bishop. And after taking the bishop, then I can simply push e7 and e8 queen. So here, you have to move the king or the bishop. So in fact, the computer suggests to move king to g7. However, after king to g7, I have the move rook to g5 check. And in fact, the pawn and the knight, they cut off the king from approaching the pawn, which is really good. So the king has to go back to the h-file. So here, in fact, or you can play bishop to g6. But if you play bishop to g6, then there's this move knight to e5. And you have to protect this bishop as it's pinned and it's only defended by the king. So here, let's say, for example, rook to h6. Then I simply have the move e7. E7, so the king can still no longer approach because of the knight and the pawn. And so simply I would push to e8, and it will become a queen. And if he sidesteps, then I can simply play rook takes g6. And in this case, there's no way of preventing my pawn from promoting to e8. So knight to d7 was my last try. However, I missed this with low time, and I simply played the move e7. And in fact, in this position, he could just sack the minor piece, the bishop, for the pawn. And in fact, in this position, we agreed to a draw because there's no way to win a knight versus bishop with only one minor piece. So, very eventful game. In fact, a very tactically filled game with that move knight to d5 earlier. That knight to d5 shot with the threat, with many different threats of knight to b6, knight to e7, as well as getting in on the back rank. Unfortunately, wasn't able to convert. Of course, it's a Grandmaster, so not much I can expect. However, a draw against a Grandmaster is still really good, especially considering my rating at the time. And yeah, hope you all enjoyed the game. And as always, like and subscribe, and thanks very much.